The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The Custom House. It's a bit strange, that. Though I'm not one to chatter about myself and my life to friends by the fire, an urge to share my story has grabbed me twice, now when speaking to my to the public. The first time was a few years ago, when I burdened readers, without much excuse and for no good reason or they could see, with a tale of my quiet days at the old manse. Now, because I was lucky enough to find a couple of listeners back then, I'm grabbing the public's attention again to talk about my 3 years at a custom house. I'm following the lead of that famous PP, clerk of this parish, pretty closely. Truth is, when an author sends his words out into the world, he's not really talking to the masses who'll toss his book aside or never pick it up, but to the few who get him better than most of his old buddies ever did. Some writers go further, spilling secrets so personal they'd only fit for one perfectly matched soul, as if their book, flung out to the world, is bound to find that missing piece of themselves and make their life whole by connecting with it. Still, it's not proper to bear everything, even when you're keeping it vague. But since thoughts freeze up and words stumble without some real tie to the audience, it's okay to picture a friendly listener, kind and understanding if not too close. That warmth melts the usual reserve, letting me ramble about what's around me, and even a bit about myself, while still keeping the deepest part of me hidden. Within those boundaries, I think an author can tell his story without stepping on the reader's toes or his own. You'll see, too, that this custom house bit has a point, a kind of literary excuse for how I got hold of the pages that follow and proof that the story in them is real. That's my main goal here, to show I'm just the editor, or barely more, of the longest tale in this book. That's the real reason I'm getting personal with you all. While I'm at it, I've thrown in a few extra details to sketch out a way of life nobody's written about before, along with some of the people in it, including me, in my hometown of Salem, at the top of what used to be a busy wharf 50 years ago in old King Derby's time, but now just sits there with rotting wooden warehouses and hardly a sign of trade. Maybe a ship unloading hides halfway down, or a Nova Scotia schooner dumping firewood closer in. Right there, with a view from its front windows down this dull scene, and across the harbour stands a big brick building. For 3.5 hours every morning the American flag flies, or droops, depending on the wind, from the highest point of its roof, with the stripes turned sideways to show it's a civilian government post, not a military one. The front has a porch with 6 wooden pillars holding up a balcony, and wide granite steps lead down to the street. Above the door looms a huge American eagle, wings spread, a shield on her chest, and, think, a mix of thunderbolts and barbed arrows in each claw. With the grumpy attitude typical of this bird, she looks ready to cause trouble for the peaceful town, especially warning anyone worried about their safety not to step onto her turf. Even so, plenty of folks are trying right now to hide under her wings, probably thinking her chest is as cozy as a feather pillow. But she's not gentle even at her best, and sooner or later, usually sooner, she'll scratch, peck, or stab her fledglings away. The pavement around this building, which we might as well call the custom house, has enough grass poking through the cracks to prove not many people have been trampling it lately. Some months, though, a morning comes when things pick up a bit. It might remind an old timer of the days before the last war with England, when Salem was its own port, not ignored like now by merchants who let her wharves rot while their ships pile up wealth in New York or Boston, on a day when a few ships roll in from Africa or South America, or are about to head out. Feet hustle up and down those granite steps. You might catch a sea-worn captain fresh off his boat with papers under his arm in a beat-up tin box before his wife even says hello, or the ship's owner, happy or sulky depending on whether his cargo's gold, worthy, or a pile of junk nobody wants. There's the young clerk, too, getting a taste for trade like a wharf pup for blood, already sending out shipments when he'd be better off playing with toy boats. You've got sailors looking for papers to shield them from the Navy, or ones just arrived, pale and weak, needing a hospital pass. And don't forget the scruffy captains of those rusty firewood schooners from Canada, not as sharp as Yankees, but keeping our fading trade alive. Gather all these folks together, like they sometimes were, with a few oddballs mixed in, and for a moment the custom house turned lively. Usually, though, you'd climb the steps and see a line of old guys in outdated chairs tipped back against the wall. They were often asleep, but now and then you'd hear them mumble between snores, with the lazy energy of folks who live off handouts or locked in jobs, not their own hard work. These were custom house officers, sitting like Matthew collecting taxes, but not likely to be called off for anything grand. On the left as you walk in, there's a room about 15 feet square and tall, with 2 arched windows looking out at the crumbling wharf, and a third peering down a narrow lane along Derby Street. You can glimpse grocers, block makers, and ship suppliers, with clusters of old sailors laughing and chatting by the doors. The room's grimy, cobwebbed with old paint peeling and grey sand scattered on the floor in a way nobody does any more. You can tell women's cleaning tools rarely touch it. There's a stove with a fat pipe, an old pine desk with a wobbly stool, a few rickety wooden chairs, and, don't miss the library, a couple dozen volumes of congressional acts, and a chunky revenue laws book on some shelves. A tin pipe runs up through the ceiling for shouting to other parts of the building. 6 months ago, pacing around or slouched on that stool with my elbow on the desk, skimming the morning paper, you might have recognized me, dear reader. The same guy who welcomed you into his cozy study, where sunlight danced through willow branches at the old manse. But if you went looking for me there now, you'd ask for the Locofoco surveyor in vain. Reform swept me out, and someone worthier took my spot and paycheck. Salem, where I was born, has a grip on me I never felt when I lived here. It's flat, dull, mostly wooden houses with no style, a long, boring street stretching across the peninsula from Gallows Hill to the almshouse. Not exactly a place to fall in love with. Still, I've got this tie to it, probably because my family's been here almost 2.5 centuries since the first of my name showed up. They've been born, died, and mixed into the dirt here, so part of me feels like it belongs. Most Americans don't get that. They move too much to care. But it's more than just dust. My first ancestor, a stern Puritan with a Bible and sword, looms large in my childhood imagination, a soldier, lawmaker, judge, and church ruler. He persecuted Quakers, and his son went after witches so hard their blood stains him still. I don't know if they regretted it or paid for it elsewhere, but I feel their shame and hope any curse on us is gone. Those old Puritans would probably think it punishment enough that their line ended up with a loafer like me. What's he do? One grumbles to another across time. Write stories! What kind of job is that? How does it help God or man? They'd scoff, but their toughness is in me too. My family's stuck around here, respectable but never famous after those first 2. For over a century, they sailed, each generation trading the sea for the homestead until they died and sank back into the soil. That long tie to one spot builds a bond, not love but instinct. I came back here, drawn like it was fate, even though I'm happier elsewhere. My kids were born elsewhere, and I'll make sure they put down roots in fresh ground. Humans don't thrive replanted in the same old dirt too long. That odd pull brought me to this brick government building after leaving the old manse. My fate was sealed. Not the first time I'd left and come back like a stubborn coin. One morning, with the president's orders in my pocket, I met the crew who'd helped me run the custom house. I'd bet no U.S. official ever had such an ancient bunch under him. General Miller, a war hero, had kept this place steady for 20 years, shielding his team through political storms. He was set in his ways, kind but slow to change. So I inherited a gang of old sailors who'd washed up here after rough lives. They had a knack for dodging death, popping up each spring after hibernating through winter. I nudged a few into retirement, and then the afterlife, giving them time to repent the shady stuff every custom house guy supposedly gets into. The front door doesn't exactly lead to heaven. Most of my crew were Whigs. Lucky I wasn't a hardcore politico, just a Democrat by habit. If I'd been a real player, I'd have axed them all fast. They feared it too. I saw their weathered faces go pale, their creaky voices shake. They knew they should have been replaced by sharper, loyal guys, and I knew it, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. So they shuffled around the wharves and steps, napping and retelling mouldy tales. They figured out quick I wasn't trouble, and went about their routines with light hearts, thinking they were useful, at least to themselves. They'd squint at ship holds, fuss over trivia, and miss big smuggling jobs right under their noses, then lock everything tight after the fact. I got fond of them, especially in summer when the heat that melted everyone else just warmed their sluggish systems. Their chatter was like kids' laughter. Simple, surface-level joy, not deep thought. Some weren't ancient, though. Strong, capable guys stuck in this dead-end life. But most were worn-out husks, hoarding useless memories like yesterday's dinner over shipwrecks they'd seen young. The inspector was the father of this crew, maybe of every U.S. tide waiter. Born into the job, his dad, a revolutionary colonel, set him up. He was pushing 80 when I met him, a marvel of vigor. Rosy, cheeked, spry in his blue coat, he laughed loud and strutted like time couldn't touch him. He had no depth, just basic urges and a sunny mood, barely enough soul to keep him upright. 3 wives and 20 kids gone. He'd sigh once and bounce back, ready to play. I studied him, fascinated. He was all body, no spirit, living easy on a steady income with no real worries. His big talent was recalling meals from 60 years ago, savoring them like they were fresh. A tough goose once ruined his day, but wars and losses, they slid off him like wind. Then there's the collector, General Miller, a war vet who'd governed a wild territory before landing here 20 years back. Nearing 70, he hobbled up the steps with help. Leaning on the rail to reach his fireside chair, he'd gaze calmly at the bustle, papers rustling, oath-sworn chatter, barely noticing it. His face was kind, lighting up if you spoke to him, showing a solid mind beneath the fog. Once he stopped talking or listening, he'd sink back into quiet, not feeble, just worn. His strength was still there, not crumbled yet. I liked watching him, feeling a fondness despite our slim connection. He'd been a hero, his "I'll try, sir," before a battle said it all. Now he seemed lost in old war tunes and fights, out of place among inkstands and clerks. After dreamy days at Brook Farm, talks with Emerson, wild chats by the Assabith with Channing, and bookish nights with Hillard and Longfellow, it was time to switch gears. Literature faded. Nature, too, except the humankind. I could have mourned losing that spark, but I knew I could call it back. This was temporary. I'd change when I needed to. I was a decent surveyor, and the merchants and captains I dealt with saw me as nothing else. My name got stamped on spice bags and cigar boxes, a weird fame I smirked at. but the past stirred sometimes, like when I found that package and started this tale. Upstairs in the custom house there's a big, unfinished room. Brick and beams, no plaster. Too much space for what's left of Salem's trade. Barrels of old papers sat in a corner, a mess of wasted effort. I poked around one rainy day, digging through ship names and merchant signatures long gone, trying to picture Salem's glory days. Then I found a small package in yellow parchment, tied with faded tape. It felt important, like a treasure. Inside was a commission for Jonathan Pugh, a surveyor from the 1700s, and a worn red cloth, with frayed gold stitching, 3¼ inches long. It puzzled me. What was it for? I pressed it to my chest and felt a burn, like it was hot iron. Not fabric. I dropped it, spooked. Wrapped around it was a dingy paper roll with Pugh's notes about Hester Prynne, a woman from the 1600s who'd stood out back then. Old folks he'd talked to remembered her as an ancient but upright figure, nursing and advising around the countryside, revered by some, a pest to others. The papers held her story, backed by that Scarlet, I've still got. I've jazzed it up some, but the bones are true. Pugh's ghost seemed to push me to share it, promising posterity's thanks. I brushed it off at first, but after drifting back to Salem, I felt the mood to write it. Somber, like the air my ancestors breathed here. A crowd waited outside Boston's prison, a grim oak and iron slab in a town already sporting a jail and graveyard despite being new. A rosebush bloomed by the door, maybe tied to Anne Hutchinson, a ribble from years back. They were there for Hester Prynne, who stepped out with a baby and a bright red on her chest. Tall, dark-haired, and striking, she faced their stares without flinching. The A marked her an adulteress, her husband missing 2 years, and here's this kid. They put her on a scaffold in the marketplace for 3 hours, a public shaming. She spotted a bent, scholarly man in the crowd, her husband back from who knows where, and he signalled her to stay mum. The leaders, including Reverend Wilson and young Arthur Dimmersdale, pressed her to name the father. She refused, taking her punishment, for life. Back in jail, her husband, calling himself Roger Chillingworth, showed up as a doctor. He was calm but furious, explaining he'd been shipwrecked and held by Native Americans. He demanded the man's name. She wouldn't budge. He vowed to find and destroy him, making her swear not to reveal he was her husband. She agreed, and he left her with little Pearl. Hester was released from prison and could have left Boston, fleeing across the sea to Europe or into the wild forests nearby. But something, maybe the pull of her sin or the man tied to it, kept her here. The town's scorn was her punishment, and she chose to face it. She settled in a small, abandoned cottage on the edge of the peninsula, near the shore. Surrounded by barren land, it was a lonely spot, perfect for her outcast life. To survive, she turned to her needlework, stitching gloves, robes, and baby clothes with a skill that stood out even in this plain Puritan world. Her work was in demand, especially for fancy occasions like Governor Swear, inns, though never weddings. Her stain ruled that out. She earned enough to live, keeping herself and Pearl fed, with a little left for the poor. But the Scarlet letter shaped everything. It cut her off from normal life, like she was under a spell. People stared, kids pointed, and even her charity was met with coldness. She dressed Pearl in bright, bold colors, reds and golds, unlike the grey Puritan norm, making her a living echo of the A. Hester herself wore drab clothes, hiding her beauty, letting the letter blaze alone. She lived simply, her days a mix of work and shame, her nights haunted by guilt and what-ifs. Some started to see her skill and quiet help as a kind of strength, but most still judged her harshly. Pearl grew into a wild, beautiful child, born from Hester's disgrace, but glowing with life. At 3 months she was already a puzzle. perfect in form, yet strange in spirit. Hester named her Pearl because she'd cost everything, a treasure bought with her soul. The girl was restless, full of energy, her dark eyes sharp and deep. Sometimes Hester wondered if she was even human, maybe an imp sent to mock her. Pearl's mood swung fast, 1 minute laughing like music, the next shrieking like a storm. She defied rules, fought other kids, and seemed to thrive on chaos. Hester loved her fiercely, but feared she'd inherited her sin's darkness. The scarlet letter-obsessed Pearl. She'd stare at it, touch it, even throw flowers at it, laughing as they hit. Once, by a brook, she made an A from green moss and pinned it on herself, grinning at Hester's shock. "What does it mean, Mother?" she'd ask over and over, her voice cutting through Hester's silence. The town saw Pearl as cursed. Some wanted her taken away, raised by stricter hands. Hester clung to her, terrified of losing the one tie she had left. Word got around that the leaders, Governor Bellingham, the ministers, might take Pearl. Hester marched to the governor's mansion to fight for her. It was a grand place, all glass and armor, flashy for a Puritan. Pearl darted around, startling the servants. Bellingham was there with old Reverend Wilson, Arthur Dimmesdale, and Roger Chillingworth, who'd become a fixture around town. Hester pleaded, saying Pearl was her punishment and her redemption, a daily reminder of her sin. They tested Pearl, asking who made her, expecting God. But she cheekily said she was plucked from the rosebush by the prison. Bellingham frowned, Wilson chuckled, but Dimmesdale stepped in. Pale and shaky, he argued Pearl was a gift to teach Hester. His voice soft but firm. They let her keep Pearl. Chillingworth watched Dimmesdale closely, a sly look in his eye. Pearl's weirdness grew with her. By 7, she was a whirlwind, called an elf child or worse by the townsfolk. She'd chase birds, mimic Hester's walk, or sit silent, staring at nothing. Kids shunned her, and she'd fight back, fierce and fearless. Hester tried to tame her, teaching her prayers, but Pearl twisted them into games. The scarlet letter still fascinated her. Once she made a green A from seaweed, asking why Hester wore it and why the minister clutched his chest. Hester dodged, but Pearl's questions stung. Meanwhile, Dimmesdale was fading. Young and brilliant, he'd been a star preacher, but now he was thin, pale, his hand always on his heart. The congregation loved him more for it, thinking it humility, but Hester saw something else. Chillingworth had latched onto him, living in his house as his doctor. The town praised the old man's care, but Hester suspected he was up to something dark. She'd catch glimpses of Dimmesdale, tortured, distant, and felt the weight of their shared secret. Chillingworth had come to Boston with a murky past, studies in Europe, time with Native Americans, and a knack for herbs and potions. People called him a leech, stuck to Dimmesdale, draining him. At first it seemed innocent, 2 scholars bonding over books, but soon it turned sinister. Chillingworth probed Dimmesdale's soul, asking about sin and health in ways that made the minister flinch. Rumors said he'd been captured by natives with a sailor who'd died, leaving him twisted. Now he was obsessed, watching Dimmesdale like a hawk, digging for the truth about Pearl. Dimmesdale's decline sped up. Chillingworth pushed deeper, hinting at hidden guilt, watching every wince. One night he crept in while Dimmesdale slept, pulled back his shirt, and saw something. Maybe a mark that made him grin like a fiend. Whatever it was, it fueled his game. Dimmesdale's sermons grew wilder, full of pain he wouldn't name, and the people ate it up, blind to his torment. Chillingworth fed on it, his revenge taking shape. The minister was a wreck inside. He knew he was Pearl's father. Hester's silence protected him, but it crushed him too. He preached purity while living a lie, his guilt a constant H. He'd stare at the scarlet letter in his mind, imagining confessing, but fear held him back. His flock saw a saint, he saw a fraud. Chillingworth's presence made it worse. Every talk about sin felt like a trap. Dimmesdale started punishing himself, fasting, staying up nights, even whipping his back raw. He'd laugh bitterly at his own weakness, half mad with the strain. One stormy night, 7 years into his torment, Arthur Dimmesdale couldn't take it any more. He slipped out of his house and climbed onto the scaffold where Hester had stood all those years ago. It was after midnight, the town asleep under a grey sky spitting rain. He stood there, shivering, imagining the crowd's judgment, feeling the shame he dodged. His guilt screamed inside him, louder than the wind, until he let out a raw, broken yell. He half expected lights to flicker on, people to rush out, but nothing. Only old Reverend Wilson shuffled by, glowing with a lantern, not noticing him. Then Mistress Hibbins, the creepy widow, cackled from her window about dancing with the devil, but she didn't see him either. Dimmesdale laughed, a hollow, crazy sound, thinking maybe he'd lost it. Then Hester and Pearl appeared, ghosts in the dark, coming back from watching a sailor die at Governor Winthrop's place. Dimmesdale called them up. Hester climbed the steps, Pearl tugging her hand, and for a moment they stood together. Her, the kid like a family nobody knew about. Pearl grabbed his hand, and he felt a jolt, like life flowing back into him. She asked if he'd stand with them tomorrow in daylight. "Not then, Pearl," he said, voice cracking. But another time, God's time, a meteor streaked across the sky, lighting everything red, and Dimmesdale swore it traced an A up there. The townsfolk later said it marked Winthrop's death, an angel now, but to Dimmesdale it was his sin blazing. Pearl giggled, pointing at a figure below. Roger Chillingworth, staring up like a shadow. Dimmesdale panicked, whispering, "Who's that?" Hester shushed Pearl, who'd called him the Black Man, and said nothing. Chillingworth climbed up, all fake concern, saying he'd found his patient sleepwalking. He led Dimmesdale home, leaving Hester and Pearl in the dark. Next day, a sexton handed Dimmesdale his glove, found on the scaffold, joking the devil must have dropped it. Dimmesdale barely answered. Hester's life had shifted over those 7 years. The Scarlet letter still burned, but people saw her differently now. Her quiet help, suing for the poor, nursing the sick, softened some hearts. Kids still taunted her, and new folks gawked, but older ones started calling the A. Abel instead of adulteress. She'd lost her old beauty, hair tucked up, face stern, but gained a strength that drew people. Women came to her with their troubles, and she listened, wise beyond her years. She wondered if her suffering could mean something bigger, maybe a chance to challenge the rules that crushed her. But Dimmesdale's decline gnawed at her. She saw him fading, pale, shaky, always clutching his chest, while Chillingworth hovered, a vulture picking at him. She blamed herself for not warning him about her husband sooner. The secret was killing them both. She decided to act. She caught Chillingworth by the shore, gathering herbs in the sand. He'd changed, his face twisted, eyes sharp with hate. Up close he looked like evil itself. "You've tortured him enough," she said, voice steady. "Let him go." Chillingworth smirked, saying Dimmesdale's fate was his own doing. 7 years of hiding had hollowed him out. He admitted he'd become a fiend, living for revenge, not caring who he'd been before. Hester said she'd kept his secret too long, hurting Dimmesdale more by silence. "He'll tell him who you are," she warned. Chillingworth laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Go ahead. He's mine already. Tortured by his own soul, I just watch." He shuffled off, leaving her furious and determined. Later, Hester took Pearl to the beach, waiting for Dimmesdale to pass by from a meeting. Pearl, 7 and wild as ever, danced around, picking shells. She made a green. A from seaweed, and stuck it on her chest, grinning at Hester's gasp. "Why do you wear yours?" she asked, sharp as a blade. "And why does the minister hold his heart?" Hester brushed it off, saying it was grown-up stuff, but Pearl's eyes narrowed. She knew more than she let on. Hester told her to run off and play, needing space to think. She spotted Dimmersdale coming through the woods and met him on a path, alone for the first time since their sin. He looked wrecked, eyes sunken, hands trembling, but the forest felt free away from town's eyes. "I'm lost," he said. "No peace, no hope, just hell waiting." Hester grabbed his hand, urgent. "You're not alone. I've got something to say." She spilled it. "That doctor, Chillingworth. He's my husband. He's been destroying you on purpose." Dimmersdale froze, then exploded. "Why didn't you tell me? 7 years of this. Him in my house, my soul. I could have fought." She took it, calm but firm. "I was wrong. I thought silence protected you, but it fed his game. Forgive me." He sank onto a log, head in hands, then softened. "I can't hate you. It's on us both." They sat, the brook gurgling nearby, and Hester pushed. "We can leave. Europe, a new life. You're killing yourself here." He hesitated, weak and scared. "I've got no strength left." She ripped off the scarlet letter, tossed it into the grass, and let her hair fall, wild, alive again. "You've got me," she said, eyes fierce. "We'll take Pearl and go." Sunlight broke through, birds sang, and for a minute it felt possible. Dimmersdale caved, hope flickering. "After the election sermon. 3 days. There's a ship." They planned it, hands clasped, a spark of their old fire rekindling. Pearl bounded over, glowing in the sun, but stopped short, seeing Hester's bare chest. She shrieked, pointing at the missing A, refusing to come closer. Hester sighed, pinned it back on, and tied her hair up. Pearl calmed, but eyed Dimmersdale warily. He kissed her forehead. She ran to the brook to scrub it off, splashing and glaring. Hester watched, heart sinking. Pearl tied them to this place, letter or not. Hester watched Pearl by the brook, her heart pounding with hope and dread. She and Dimmersdale had just planned their escape. 3 days, until the ship sailed after his big sermon. Pearl danced back, all light and mischief, her dark curls bouncing. Hester smiled, thinking how she'd fit into their new life. "She's ours," she said to Dimmersdale, squeezing his hand. "Yours and mine." He nodded, nervous but warm, watching Pearl with a father's eyes for the first time. She looked like Hester, same beauty, same fire, but wilder, untamed. Pearl stopped short, staring at them. She'd seen Hester without the letter, hair down, and it threw her. Now, with the A, back on. She frowned, then pointed at Dimmersdale. "Who's he?" she demanded. Hester called her over, but Pearl wouldn't budge, stumping her foot by the water. "Come kiss your mother," Hester said, firm. Pearl glared, then shrieked, a piercing wail that echoed through the trees, until Hester relented, tying her hair tighter. Only then did Pearl skip over, hugging her hard, then turning to Dimmersdale. He bent down, kissed her forehead, soft and shaky. She bolted to the brook, splashing water to wash it off, giggling like it burned. Hester winced. Pearl sensed the truth but fought it. Dimmersdale left for town, jittery but lighter, like a weight had lifted. Hester worried Pearl's fit meant trouble, but brushed it off. She'll get used to him, she told herself. The forest faded behind them, its freedom a memory as they stepped back into Boston's grey grip. Back home, Dimmersdale felt alive, stronger than he'd been in years. The escape plan fired him up. He met a parishioner who'd cursed him once, a woman he'd turned away from sin, and a deacon with dry theology, all people he dreaded facing. Now he brushed them off, words sharp and free. His old sermon draft looked weak. He tossed it and started fresh, writing through the night with a feverish energy. Chillingworth knocked, offering medicine, but Dimmesdale waved him away, sharp and cold. The old man's eyes narrowed. He smelled a change. Election day dawned, a big deal in Boston. New governor, big sermon, everyone out. The square buzzed with Puritans in their stiff best. Sailors from the ship Hester had booked, even a few Native Americans watching from the edges. Music blared, drums, horns, a rare jolt of life. Hester stood with Pearl, who twirled in a red dress, drawing stairs. The ship's captain nodded to Hester, confirming their passage tomorrow. She'd kept it quiet, but a sailor let slip to Pearl they were sailing soon. With the minister? Pearl asked, sly. Hester shushed her, uneasy. Mistress Hibbins sidled up, all velvet and ruffles, whispering about the forest. I saw you with him. Dancing with the black man, maybe. Hester froze, denying it, but Hibbins cackled. That saintly preacher's got secrets. You'll see. She vanished into the crowd, leaving Hester rattled. The captain added more bad news. Chillingworth had booked a spot on the ship. He says he's with you. The guy grinned. Hester's stomach dropped. Her husband wasn't letting go. The procession kicked off. Soldiers in gleaming steel, plumes bobbing. Then the magistrates, all dignity and weight. Bellingham, Wilson, the old guard marched slow, faces carved from stone. Dimmesdale followed, leading the ministers, and Hester couldn't believe it. He strode tall, eyes bright, nothing like the broken man she'd held in the woods. Pearl tugged her sleeve. Is that him? Will he kiss me now? Hester hushed her. Not here, child. Hibbins' words echoed. Dimmesdale seemed untouchable, miles from her. She felt lost, groping for him in the noise. Inside the church, Dimmesdale preached. His voice soared, rich with pain and power. The crowd hung on every word, some crying, others praying. Hester waited outside with Pearl, catching echoes through the door. It was his masterpiece, they said later, wholly haunting, like he'd poured his soul into it. When it ended, the procession filed out toward the town hall, music swelling. Dimmesdale emerged, pale now, staggering. The crowd parted, awed. He veered toward the scaffold, steps faltering, and waved Hester and Pearl over. Chillingworth lunged, hissing, "Dunt! You'll ruin it!" Dimmesdale shook him off. No more hiding, he rasped, climbing up. Hester joined him, Pearl in tow, the crowd buzzing. Dimmesdale leaned on her, trembling. "I'm the one," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "Hairsin's mine, Pearl's my daughter." Gasps rippled out. He tore open his shirt, revealing a raw, red A, scarred into his chest. Years of self-punishment etched there. Some swore they saw it glow. Others called it a trick of light. "God's mercy's on us now," he said, voice fading. Pearl climbed up, kissed his lips, her first real touch, and he smiled, tears falling. Chillingworth raged below. "You've escaped, May." Dimmesdale sank down, blessing Hester, asking if this was better than their runaway dream. "Better," she whispered, crying. He died there, head on her shoulder, the crowd stunned silent. After Dimmesdale's death on the scaffold, people couldn't agree on what they'd witnessed. Some swore they saw a red, scarred into his chest, a mirror to Hester's, etched by years of hidden guilt, proof of divine justice breaking through. Others insisted there was nothing, just skin, and his confession stood alone, a dying man's raw truth. Wilder stories spread that the mark flared the day he sinned with Hester, or Chillingworth's drugs conjured it, or it was his soul's agony burning outward. Some still tied the meter to Governor Winthrop's passing, not Dimmesdale's shame, but most walked away feeling a heavy mix of human and heavenly judgment. Chillingworth withered fast after that, his whole life tormenting Dimmesdale, collapsed when the minister owned his sin and died free. With no revenge left, he faded, a shell, and within a year he was dead, Cause unclear, just emptiness. His will stunned everyone. He left a fortune, land and cash from England and here. To Pearl, the child of the sin he'd despised. Folks guessed it was guilt or a warped redemption, but nobody knew. Hester and Pearl disappeared soon after. The cottage emptied, and rumours flew. Maybe they'd sailed away, maybe vanished into the wild. Years rolled by, and Hester's tale grew soft, almost mythic. Then she returned alone, older, quieter, stepping back into that house like time hadn't passed. The scarlet letter clung to her chest. Worn but vivid, her choice now, not a punishment. Pearl's fate stayed locked in Hester's silence, though hints slipped through. A package of fine stitching, an unsigned note, suggesting a rich life far off, maybe married, maybe a mother, all thanks to Chillingworth's money. Hester lived simply, but not cut off. Women sought her out, girls with crushed hearts, wives with buried pain, and she'd listen by her fire, offering sharp, soothing words. She spoke of a future where a woman might fix what men like her judges had broken, though it'd take purer souls than hers. Some stopped seeing their eye. As a curse, they called her an angel, a steady light in their chaos. She grew frail. But that letter held on, a sign of all she'd endured. When she died, they laid her near Dimmesdale in the old graveyard, close but not touching under one stone. It was rough red, tinged, and simple, bearing no names or dates. Just a carved A, standing out bold. Grass crept around it, and the prison rosebush kept blooming. Like it understood, people gazed at that stone, feeling sin love, and time knotted together. Hester's life, her fall, her strength, her quiet end, lingered in the town as lasting as the mark she bore, and there it stood, etched for all to see on a black field, the letter A in red.